A stranger at the door. The rain had a way of changing the world, softening sharp edges and pulling old memories to the surface. And that evening, it fell steadily over the quiet street where Keanu Reeves lived, each drop tapping against the pavement like a patient reminder that some nights were not meant to pass unnoticed. The house was dark except for the warm glow of a single lamp inside, and Keanu sat alone near the window, his posture relaxed but his thoughts restless, the kind of restlessness that came not from exhaustion but from reflection. He had finished a long day of work, conversations and cameras and polite smiles, yet when the door closed behind him hours earlier, the silence that followed felt heavier than usual, as if it were waiting for something to disturb it. He had learned to be comfortable with solitude over the years, to sit with it rather than fight it, but that night it pressed against him in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a pause stretched too long before a truth finally spoke. He was in the middle of pouring himself a cup of tea when the knock came, 3 measured taps that echoed through the hallway and stopped him mid-motion, the sound cutting through the quiet with a deliberate certainty. Keanu frowned slightly, setting the cup down, listening as the rain intensified outside, its rhythm suddenly sharper, almost urgent. No one ever came unannounced, not here, not anymore, and his mind ran through possibilities he quickly dismissed, until a second knock followed, softer but no less intentional, as though whoever stood on the other side understood the gravity of asking to be let in. He took a breath, steady and calm, and moved toward the door, feeling a subtle tightening in his chest he could not explain. When he opened it, a stranger stood there, drenched from head to toe, rainwater dripping from the edge of a dark hood pulled low over his face. He looked younger than Keanu expected, perhaps in his early 30s, but there was a weariness in his posture that made him seem older, like someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something that sat behind his eyes when he finally lifted his head just enough for the porch light to reveal his expression. Those eyes were haunted, alert and fearful all at once, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but strained, as if each word required effort. "You don't know me," he said quietly, "but someone very close to you sent me." Keanu felt his pulse quicken, his instincts sharpening as he studied the man's face, searching for any sign of deception but finding only sincerity edged with desperation. "Who?" he asked, his voice even though his heart had already begun to race ahead of the answer. The stranger swallowed, rain mixing with something that looked dangerously close to tears, and then he said the name that landed like a sudden impact, heavy and unmistakable. Sandra. For a moment the world seemed to narrow, the sound of rain fading into the background as Keanu stood frozen, the name echoing in his mind with a force that surprised him. Sandra Bullock. It had been years since they last spoke, years filled with distance, quiet respect, and unresolved memories that neither of them had known how to revisit. She had always had a way of reaching him without effort, of occupying a space in his life that remained even when everything else moved on. But this, sending a stranger to his door in the middle of a storm, felt wrong in a way that set off every instinct he had. "Sandra sent you?" he repeated softly, more to himself than to the man standing before him. The stranger nodded, relief flickering across his face as if the hardest part had been saying her name out loud. "She said you'd listen," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "and that you'd understand before it's too late." Keanu did not hesitate. He stepped aside and gestured for him to come in, the decision instinctive rather than deliberate, guided by a sense that whatever was unfolding could not be ignored. The man crossed the threshold quickly, shedding his soaked jacket and standing awkwardly just inside the door, as if unsure whether he truly belonged there. Keanu closed the door behind him, shutting out the rain, and moved toward the fireplace, lighting it with practiced ease as warmth slowly returned to the room. As the flames came to life, they cast shifting shadows across the stranger's face, revealing exhaustion etched into his features, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and something heavier than fatigue. Keanu watched him carefully, offering him a seat and a towel without a word, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. "You're shaking," Keanu said gently after a moment, not as an accusation but an observation, the same way he had learned to speak to people who were carrying invisible pain. The man nodded, sitting down slowly. "I've been on the road for 2 days," he admitted. "I didn't know if I'd make it here." Keanu studied him, his mind working through layers of intuition built over years of reading people, and while caution remained, it was tempered by the undeniable honesty in the stranger's voice. "Tell me why you're here," he said at last, his tone calm but firm, an invitation that carried the weight of expectation. The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded letter, its edges worn and slightly torn, the ink smudged in places by rain. He held it out with trembling fingers. "She said you'd know what this means." The moment Keanu took the letter, he recognized the handwriting, the delicate, familiar curves that brought with them a rush of memories he had not realized were still so vivid. He unfolded it carefully, his chest tightening as he read the short message written inside, each line deliberate and heavy with implication. "If he reaches you, it means I've done something I can't undo. Don't turn him away, Keanu. Please help him. He carries the truth that I couldn't face." Keanu read it again, slower this time, the room feeling smaller with each word, the fire crackling softly as if urging him forward. "Where is she?" he asked quietly, looking up from the letter, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping as though the question had been waiting to crush him. "I don't know," he said. "She disappeared 3 nights ago." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the kind of realization that shifted something fundamental. Sandra did not disappear without reason. She was careful, thoughtful, and strong, someone who faced problems head-on even when they terrified her. And the idea that she was gone, truly gone, sent a chill through Keanu that had nothing to do with the fading rain outside. The stranger spoke again, explaining that Sandra had told him to come to Keanu because there was no one else who would understand what she could not say out loud. And as he spoke, fragments of memory surfaced in Keanu's mind, moments he had once dismissed as insignificant now demanding attention. When the man mentioned an accident years earlier, one Sandra had never spoken about beyond what was necessary, Keanu felt a familiar ache settle in his chest, the memory of her withdrawal afterward, the way she had chosen silence over explanation. "What do you know about it?" he asked carefully, sensing that the answer would change more than just his understanding of the past. The stranger's eyes filled as he spoke the words that sent a ripple of cold through the room. "I caused it," he said, his voice breaking just enough to reveal the guilt beneath. He explained how he had been driving the truck that night, how he had wanted to come forward but had been stopped, not by fear alone, but by Sandra herself, who had chosen forgiveness in a way that cost her more than anyone ever knew. Keanu listened, his expression softening, recognizing the depth of pain in the man before him. And when the stranger mentioned a key, something Sandra had given Keanu years ago with no explanation, the pieces began to align with an unsettling clarity. Without a word, Keanu rose and walked to his study, opening a small drawer where a silver key lay untouched, exactly where it had been placed long ago. He held it up, the metal catching the firelight, and watched as recognition flooded the stranger's face. "That's it," the man whispered. "She said it would lead to the truth." Keanu looked at the key, then back at the letter in his hand, feeling the weight of destiny settle around him, the sense that this moment had been waiting for him for years. "You're staying here tonight," Keanu said finally, his voice steady, leaving no room for argument. "We'll find her together." The stranger nodded, relief and fear mingling in his expression, and as Keanu placed the key beside the letter on the table, he felt something stir within him, a pull toward unfinished promises and truths long delayed. Outside, the rain softened into a quiet drizzle, thunder fading into the distance, and as the fire burned steadily behind them, Keanu understood that the knock at his door had not been random. It was the beginning of a journey that would test everything he believed about loyalty, courage, and the quiet power of choosing to listen when the truth finally asked to be heard. The weight of truth. Morning arrived slowly, not with clarity but with a gray heaviness that settled over the house like an unspoken warning, the kind of morning that did not rush the world forward, but instead forced it to linger in reflection. Keanu Reeves stood by the kitchen window holding a mug of untouched coffee, watching the rainwater drip from the edge of the roof and fall into the garden below, each drop echoing the steady rhythm of thoughts he had not managed to quiet all night. Sleep had come in fragments, brief and restless, filled with memories of laughter shared years ago, and silences that now felt heavier than words. Behind him, the stranger stirred on the couch near the dying embers of the fireplace, the lines of exhaustion still etched deep into his face even as he woke, as though rest had become something he no longer trusted. They spoke little at first, moving carefully around the truths that hovered between them until Keanu finally broke the silence with a question that felt overdue. He asked the man to tell him everything, not just the pieces shaped by guilt or fear, but the moments that had left scars no one else could see. The stranger introduced himself properly then, his name steady despite the tremor in his hands, and began to speak in long, halting sentences that carried the weight of years spent running from memory. He explained how Sandra had found him after the accident, not as an angry victim, but as someone who understood that broken people often hid behind their worst mistakes. How she had spoken to him about forgiveness not as absolution, but as responsibility, something that demanded honesty even when it hurt. As he talked, Keanu listened with an intensity that went beyond politeness, recognizing in the man's voice the same kind of quiet despair he had seen in his own reflection during darker moments of his life. When the stranger finally mentioned that Sandra had grown fearful in recent months, that her phone calls had shifted from calm conversations to whispered warnings, Keanu felt a knot tighten in his chest. She had sensed something closing in on her, something tied to the past she had tried so hard to bury, and the realization made his earlier assumptions feel painfully naive. He asked about the night of the accident again, pressing gently but firmly this time, and the answer came slower, heavier, revealing details that had never made it into any official report. There had been another presence that night, someone whose existence seemed to dissolve as soon as questions were asked, someone powerful enough to turn a violent collision into a footnote and a witness into a ghost. The stranger spoke of fear that went beyond legal consequences, fear rooted in the understanding that truth, when it threatened the wrong people, became dangerous. Keanu paced the room as he listened, the silver key resting cold and solid in his pocket, its weight now symbolic of everything Sandra had chosen not to say. He thought back to the cabin by the lake, a place she had once described as the only corner of the world where her thoughts did not chase her, and the memory struck him with sudden clarity. That place had been more than an escape for her. It had been a sanctuary, a quiet promise to herself that she could still breathe somewhere untouched by expectation or fear. When he spoke the cabin's name out loud, the stranger's reaction confirmed what Keanu already knew, that whatever Sandra had left behind would be there, waiting patiently in a place that trusted silence. The decision to go felt inevitable rather than brave, a step forward driven by necessity instead of heroism. And as they prepared to leave, Keanu found himself moving with a calm resolve that surprised him. He packed lightly, instinctively, choosing items not for comfort but for clarity, and before locking the door, he paused long enough to take down an old photograph tucked away on a shelf. It showed him and Sandra Bullock years earlier, caught mid-laughter during a break in filming, both of them soaked from artificial rain and smiling as if the world had momentarily forgotten to ask anything of them. The irony was not lost on him as he slipped the photograph into his bag, aware that rain, real or staged, had always marked the turning points of their story. The drive toward the mountains unfolded in near silence, the road stretching ahead like a thread pulled tight between past and present, and as the city receded behind them, Keanu felt the familiar pull of memory growing stronger. He remembered quiet conversations with Sandra about fear and fame, about how success could amplify wounds instead of healing them, and how she had once said that the hardest part of surviving was pretending you were untouched. The stranger watched the landscape pass with an expression caught somewhere between hope and dread, understanding that the journey was as much about facing himself as it was about finding her. When the lake finally came into view, its surface calm and reflective beneath the muted sky, Keanu felt his breath catch, the place unchanged yet heavy with everything it represented. The cabin stood exactly where it always had, modest and still, as though it had been holding its breath for their return, and stepping inside felt like crossing into a memory that refused to fade. Dust coated the furniture, and the scent of wood and earth lingered in the air, but there were signs of Sandra everywhere, small and deliberate, from a handwritten note tucked into a frame to the careful arrangement of objects that suggested intention rather than abandonment. Together, they searched quietly, the absence of sound amplifying every movement, until their persistence was rewarded by the discovery of something hidden, something deliberately placed where only trust would lead it to be found. As Keanu turned the silver key in the lock of the small metal box, he felt the unmistakable shift of a story crossing a threshold, and when the lid opened to reveal a letter and a small device, the truth Sandra had carried so carefully finally began to breathe. The letter, written in her familiar hand, spoke of regret and resolve, of a past shaped by choices made under pressure, and a present threatened by secrets that refused to stay buried. It was not a confession seeking sympathy, but a testament to her understanding that silence, when used to protect the wrong people, became its own form of harm. Keanu read it slowly, absorbing each word as if it were being spoken directly to him. And when he finished, he knew without doubt that Sandra had trusted him not just to find her truth, but to stand with it, regardless of where it led. The realization settled heavily as they stepped back outside, the lake reflecting a sky that seemed to mirror their uncertainty. And for the first time since the knock at the door, Keanu felt the full scope of what lay ahead. This was no longer about a missing friend or an unresolved past. It was about confronting a system that thrived on fear and silence, and choosing whether truth was worth the cost it demanded. As he looked out across the water, the quiet resolve that had guided him this far hardened into something unshakable, and he understood that whatever awaited them next, turning back was no longer an option. Shadows that follow. The drive back from the lake felt longer than the journey there, not because of distance, but because of what now rode silently between them, the truth pressing against the windows of the car as if it were alive and impatient. Keanu Reeves kept his eyes on the road, the steady rhythm of the tires against asphalt grounding him as his mind replayed every word from Sandra's letter, every hesitation in the stranger's voice, every detail that no longer felt accidental. The cabin had not just been a hiding place. It had been a confession waiting for courage to arrive, and now that courage had come, whether any of them were ready or not. The stranger sat beside him, shoulders tense, glancing at the rearview mirror more often than necessary, as if the past itself might appear there, headlights cutting through memory and fear alike. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, dusk had settled in, painting the skyline in muted oranges and grays, and it was there at a long red light beneath an overpass that Keanu noticed the car behind them for the third time since they had left the mountains. It wasn't close enough to be obvious, but it wasn't far enough to feel coincidental either. A dark sedan that slowed when they slowed and stopped when they stopped, its presence subtle but persistent. Keanu did not mention it at first, choosing instead to test his suspicion, taking an unnecessary turn and then another, watching as the sedan mirrored their movements with patient precision. The stranger noticed, too, his breathing quickening as realization set in, and when Keanu finally spoke, his voice was calm but unmistakably serious, confirming what they both already knew without saying it out loud. They did not drive home. Instead, Keanu turned toward a quieter part of the city, streets he knew well enough to navigate without thinking, places where anonymity still existed in pockets and corners. The sedan stayed with them until, at a sudden merge, Keanu slipped into traffic and disappeared, his hands steady on the wheel as his heart pounded harder than he would ever admit. When they finally pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of a closed community center, the engine idled in the silence, and neither man moved for a long moment, the gravity of what had just happened settling in slowly. Someone knew they had gone to the lake. Someone knew they had found something, and that knowledge shifted everything from memory into immediate danger. Inside the quiet of the car, the stranger's voice broke first, thick with fear and disbelief as he asked how anyone could have followed them so easily. Keanu answered honestly, explaining that power rarely announced itself with force at first. It watched, waited, learned patterns, and then applied pressure where it hurt most. Sandra had understood that, which was why she had vanished instead of fighting openly, and the realization that she had been protecting not only herself but others weighed heavily on both of them. As they talked, Keanu pieced together fragments of conversations from years ago, moments when Sandra Bullock had hinted at unease without ever naming its source, moments he had brushed aside as the natural cost of fame, never imagining how literal her fear had been. They decided not to return to Keanu's house, understanding instinctively that familiarity now made it vulnerable, and instead drove to a small, unassuming hotel on the edge of the city, the kind of place designed to be forgotten as soon as you left it. The lobby was quiet, the clerk uninterested, and anonymity wrapped around them like a thin but welcome shield as they moved down the hallway and into a room that smelled faintly of detergent and stale air. Keanu locked the door carefully, checking the windows and the adjoining wall with the methodical calm of someone who had accepted the situation rather than panicked over it. When they finally sat down, the silence between them felt different from before, sharpened now by the understanding that they were no longer simply searching for answers, but actively being resisted. The letter from Sandra lay open on the small table between them, its words absorbing the dim light of the room, and Keanu read it again, slower this time, noticing details he had missed earlier. She had not written in fear. She had written with intention, each sentence a step toward reclaiming control of a narrative that had been stolen from her. The stranger watched him closely, his expression shifting as Keanu shared what he noticed, the subtle clues that suggested Sandra had not disappeared in desperation, but in preparation, that she had planned for this moment, for the truth to surface only when it could no longer be contained. That understanding brought a fragile sense of hope, the idea that Sandra was not merely hiding but actively working towards something larger than her own safety. Hours passed as they talked through possibilities, mapping connections, testing theories against memory and logic, until exhaustion began to blur the edges of their focus. Keanu insisted the stranger rest, taking the chair by the window himself, watching the city lights flicker like distant signals in the dark. He thought about how often stories of resilience were framed as grand, dramatic victories, when in reality they were built from quiet endurance, from choosing not to give up even when fear whispered that surrender would be easier. Sandra had lived that truth, and now it was his turn to honor it, not by rescuing her as a hero might, but by standing firm when the shadows tried to close in. Sometime near dawn, Keanu's phone vibrated softly in his hand, the unfamiliar number lighting up the screen like a pulse of electricity. He hesitated only a second before answering, stepping into the bathroom to speak in a low voice, and when he heard her breathe on the other end, unsteady but unmistakably alive, the tension he had been carrying finally cracked. She did not say much, only enough to confirm what he needed to know, that she was safe for now, that time was short, and that he had to trust the path she had set in motion. Before the call ended, she reminded him of something she had once told him long ago, that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to keep moving despite it. And when the line went dead, Keanu stood there for a long moment, absorbing the truth that had just reshaped everything again. When he returned to the room and shared the news, relief washed over the stranger's face, followed quickly by determination, the kind that comes when fear is replaced by purpose. They both understood now that Sandra was not waiting to be found. She was waiting for the truth to be strong enough to stand on its own. As the sun began to rise, casting pale light through the thin curtains, Keanu felt the weight of responsibility settle fully onto his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a choice he was ready to make. The shadows were no longer just following them. They were being challenged, and in that challenge lay the beginning of something irreversible, a turning point where silence would finally lose its power. The line that couldn't be erased. The morning light crept into the small hotel room cautiously, as if even the sun understood that this was not a day meant for comfort or ease, but for decisions that would leave permanent marks. Keanu Reeves had not slept at all, not because exhaustion failed him, but because clarity had finally arrived, sharp and unwavering, replacing the fog of uncertainty that had surrounded him since the knock at his door. He stood by the window watching the city wake up in fragments, delivery trucks rumbling down side streets, a jogger passing by with headphones on, unaware that just a few floors above him, a quiet war over truth and silence was taking shape. The normalcy of it all felt almost surreal, a reminder that life rarely paused for moral reckonings, even when they mattered deeply to those living them. The stranger, now no longer just a messenger but a participant bound by shared risk, sat at the small table nursing a cup of coffee, his hands steadier than they had been the day before, though his eyes still carried the weight of everything he had confessed. The phone call Keanu had taken earlier hung between them like a fragile bridge, and when Keanu finally spoke, confirming that Sandra was alive, the relief that crossed the man's face was immediate but restrained, as though hope itself felt dangerous to trust fully. They talked then, not in hurried fragments, but in long, deliberate reflections, piecing together the pattern that now seemed impossible to ignore, the careful choreography of pressure, silence, and power that had shaped Sandra's choices for years. Keanu explained what the call had confirmed for him, that Sandra Bullock had not disappeared out of fear alone, but had stepped into the shadows intentionally, positioning herself where she could not be controlled or erased as easily. She had known that the truth she carried was too volatile to release impulsively, that exposing it required patience and preparation, and most of all, allies who understood that justice did not always arrive through official channels. The stranger listened intently, nodding slowly as the pieces fell into place, realizing that Sandra's forgiveness toward him had been part of a larger moral framework, one where accountability mattered, but so did protecting innocent lives from becoming collateral damage. As the hours passed, they began outlining what could be done next, not with bravado or reckless urgency, but with the measured caution of people who understood the cost of missteps. Keanu reached out quietly to one of the few individuals he trusted implicitly, someone outside the machinery of fame and influence, an investigative journalist known more for integrity than headlines. He did not offer details over the phone, only enough to secure a private meeting, trusting that discretion would be respected. It was a calculated risk, but one grounded in the belief that truth needed witnesses, not just courage. They left the hotel separately, deliberately, Keanu walking several blocks before entering a cafe where the journalist waited, the noise of casual conversation and clinking cups providing a cover that felt almost ironic given the gravity of what he was about to reveal. When he began to speak, he did not dramatize or embellish. He laid out the facts as he understood them, the accident that wasn't, the silence that had been enforced, the disappearance that was anything but random. The journalist listened without interruption, taking notes sparingly, eyes sharp with the recognition that this was not a story to rush but one to verify meticulously. When Keanu finished, there was a long pause, followed by a single sentence that confirmed the stakes had shifted irreversibly, a promise that if the truth could be substantiated, it would not be buried again. Meanwhile, the stranger remained on the move, following Sandra's instructions from memory rather than message, visiting places she had once mentioned in passing as anchors, locations that held meaning without drawing attention. In one such place, a modest storage facility on the edge of town, he found what Sandra had hinted at without ever naming directly, a box tucked away under a false name, containing documents and recordings that painted a picture far larger than any one person's wrongdoing. It was evidence not just of intimidation, but of a system that thrived on leverage, using fear as currency and silence as collateral. The weight of it left him shaken, but also resolute, because for the first time the truth was tangible, undeniable, and ready to be shared. When they reunited later that evening, the air between them felt charged, not with panic but with purpose. Keanu examined the contents carefully, recognizing the careful restraint with which Sandra had gathered it all, never enough to provoke immediate retaliation, but sufficient to expose patterns once combined with testimony and time. He understood then why she had trusted him with the key, why she had chosen him as the person to stand at the threshold between secrecy and exposure. This was not about revenge or vindication. It was about reclaiming agency in a world that often punished those who refused to compromise their integrity. As night settled in again, quieter this time but no less intense, Keanu felt the familiar pull of reflection, thinking about how easily life could have continued unchanged if he had ignored the knock at his door, if he had chosen comfort over involvement. Instead, he found himself standing at a line that could not be erased, a point beyond which neutrality no longer existed. The stranger voiced what they were both thinking, that once this truth was released, there would be no return to anonymity or safety as it once existed, and Keanu acknowledged it with a calm nod, accepting that some costs were unavoidable when principles were tested. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one, illuminating streets where people moved through their lives unaware of the quiet reckoning unfolding beyond their sight. Inside, Keanu felt a steady resolve take hold, the kind that did not rely on anger or fear, but on the simple understanding that silence, when it protected harm, became a choice rather than an accident. Whatever followed next would be difficult, and likely messy, but as he looked at the evidence laid out before him and thought of Sandra waiting in the shadows, he knew this chapter was no longer about uncovering the truth alone. It was about deciding who would stand when that truth finally demanded to be seen. When silence pushes back, night did not fall so much as it pressed inward, thick and watchful, wrapping the city in a hush that felt deliberate, as if the streets themselves were listening for missteps. Keanu Reeves stood at the edge of a rooftop parking structure, the wind tugging at his jacket while the city's lights stretched below him in uneven constellations, each one a reminder of how many lives continued untouched by the decisions now narrowing around him. The evidence Sandra had left was no longer an abstract collection of documents and recordings. It had weight, consequence, and an unmistakable gravity that bent every conversation toward its center. The question was no longer whether the truth existed, but whether it would be allowed to breathe once exposed, and Keanu understood that this was the moment when resistance would harden, when silence would stop retreating and start pushing back. He met the journalist again in a place chosen for its ordinariness, a late-night diner where fluorescent lights hummed and the smell of coffee clung to the air. And as they sat across from each other, Keanu sensed the shift in tone immediately. Verification had begun, sources had been contacted, names cross-checked and patterns compared, and the story that emerged was no longer confined to Sandra's past alone. It was larger, older, and more entrenched than either of them had expected, a web of influence that thrived on invisibility, built by people who believed consequence was something that happened to others. The journalist spoke carefully, explaining that once published, the story would invite scrutiny not just of one powerful figure, but of an entire ecosystem that preferred to remain unexamined, and Keanu listened without interruption, already aware that the cost of truth often arrived before its vindication. Meanwhile, the stranger moved through the city with quiet urgency, following instructions Sandra had given him long before any of this began, visiting a final location that had been mentioned only once, almost casually, as though disguising importance through understatement. It was there in a small rented office space tucked above a closed storefront that he found what Sandra had called her contingency, a sealed envelope addressed not to the press or authorities, but to the public itself, written in language that was direct, restrained, and unmistakably hers. It was not an accusation fueled by anger, but a measured account of choices made under pressure, of threats that hid behind contracts and favors, and of the cost of staying silent when silence protected harm. Reading it left him shaken, because it was clear she had written it not to save herself, but to leave behind something honest enough to outlive fear. When they regrouped, the tension between them was different now, sharpened by the understanding that their movements were being watched more closely than ever. Keanu noticed it in small things, a car idling too long at an intersection, a phone call that cut off abruptly, the sense that coincidence had stopped being random. Yet even in that tightening circle, resolve held firm, reinforced by the knowledge that Sandra had anticipated this resistance and prepared for it with patience rather than panic. Keanu thought of her often then, of Sandra Bullock choosing to disappear not as an escape, but as a strategic silence, one that denied her adversaries the satisfaction of control while allowing the truth to gather strength beyond their reach. The first attempt to discredit the story came quietly, through whispers rather than statements, anonymous suggestions that what was coming was exaggerated, emotionally driven, or rooted in misunderstandings from years past. Keanu recognized the tactic immediately, having seen it deployed countless times against people with fewer resources and less visibility, and the familiarity of it only deepened his resolve. He refused to respond publicly, understanding that premature defense often strengthened false narratives, and instead focused on ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would do so with clarity and corroboration, leaving little room for dismissal. The journalist agreed, emphasizing patience, the slow accumulation of credibility that could not be easily dismantled. As pressure mounted, Keanu found himself reflecting on the nature of courage, how it was so often mistaken for loud defiance rather than sustained commitment. This was not a moment for dramatic gestures or righteous speeches. It was a test of endurance, of staying steady when fear attempted to rush decisions. He spoke with the stranger late into the night, reminding him that guilt, while understandable, could not be allowed to distort the present, that accountability did not require self-destruction, only honesty and willingness to stand when called. The man listened, visibly steadied by the reminder that redemption was not a single act, but a continuous choice to do better when it mattered most. The night before the story was scheduled to run, Keanu received a message that stopped him cold, a brief, encrypted note that contained no threats, only a reminder that consequences were still on the table, implied rather than declared. He read it once, then deleted it, feeling neither panic nor anger, only a profound sadness that such warnings still carried weight in a world that claimed to value transparency. He did not share the message, choosing instead to absorb it quietly, understanding that fear lost much of its power when it was acknowledged without being obeyed. As dawn approached, the city began to stir again, unaware that by the end of the day, a carefully maintained silence would fracture, sending ripples through places accustomed to immunity. Keanu stood at the window of his apartment, the early light catching on the glass, and allowed himself a moment of stillness, not to brace for impact, but to recognize how far he had already come from the man who had opened his door to a stranger in the rain. Whatever followed would be complex and uncomfortable, but it would be honest, and that mattered more than any promise of safety. Somewhere beyond the city's noise, Sandra waited, trusting that the line she had drawn would finally hold. And as the morning fully arrived, Keanu understood that silence had pushed back with everything it had, and now it was time for truth to answer. The door that opened everything. The morning the story broke did not arrive with thunder or spectacle, but with an eerie calm that felt almost respectful. as though the world itself paused to take a breath before absorbing what had long been hidden beneath its surface. Keanu Reeves sat quietly at his kitchen table, the same place where days earlier he had first read Sandra's handwriting again, and listened to the muted sounds of the city filtering through the open window. Cars passed, someone laughed on the sidewalk below, a radio played faintly from a neighboring apartment, and the ordinariness of it all stood in stark contrast to the irreversible shift now unfolding beyond his walls. He did not check his phone immediately. He already knew what would be there, and more importantly, he knew that once he looked, there would be no going back to the space of not knowing how the world had chosen to respond. When he finally did glance at the screen, the scale of it became clear in an instant. The investigation had gone live, meticulously documented, layered with corroboration that left little room for dismissal, and within minutes it was everywhere, shared not with outrage first, but with stunned recognition. The silence that had protected power for so long fractured not with screams, but with questions, and those questions spread faster than any attempt to contain them. Keanu felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep, grounding sense of inevitability, as if the truth, once given a clear path, had simply resumed its natural course. This was never about spectacle or punishment. It was about acknowledgement, about forcing a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. Across the city, in a place deliberately chosen for its distance from attention, Sandra Bullock watched the same story unfold on a small screen, her posture still, her expression unreadable until the final lines were spoken aloud. For the first time in years, she did not feel the reflexive tightening in her chest that had accompanied any mention of the past. The fear that had once dictated her silence no longer held authority over her breathing, and while uncertainty remained, it no longer owned her choices. She thought about the night she had written the letter, the careful restraint it took not to explain everything, to trust that someone else would know when and how to act, and she allowed herself a quiet moment of gratitude that trust had not been misplaced. The stranger, whose life had been defined for so long by a single mistake, felt the shift differently, more internally than publicly, as if a weight he had learned to carry as permanent had finally loosened its grip. Accountability was no longer a private burden. It had become part of a larger truth that contextualized his actions without erasing their impact. He understood now that forgiveness, the kind Sandra had offered him years ago, was never meant to absolve him quietly, but to give him the chance to stand when it mattered, to add his voice to a truth that demanded completeness. When his testimony was finally included, not as a spectacle but as confirmation, he felt something close to peace for the first time since the rain-soaked night that had changed all their lives. The backlash when it came was sharp but fragmented, the familiar attempts to reframe and minimize colliding with evidence too thorough to dismiss. Keanu watched it unfold with measured distance, declining interviews, resisting the pull of commentary, understanding that his role had never been to dominate the narrative, but to hold the door open long enough for the truth to step through on its own. He thought often of how easy it would have been to close that door on the night of the knock, to decide that involvement carried too much risk, and he recognized with clarity that the most defining moments in life were rarely announced as such. They arrived quietly, disguised as inconvenience, asking only whether you were willing to listen. Days passed, then weeks, and the world adjusted as it always did, absorbing the story into its collective memory, reshaping conversations about power, silence, and accountability in ways that were subtle but lasting. Investigations expanded, questions reached farther than expected, and the system that had once relied on quiet compliance now found itself exposed to sustained scrutiny. It was not a clean ending, nor a perfect one, but it was honest, and that honesty created space for something new to exist where fear once dominated. When Sandra finally chose to step back into public view, it was not as a return to fame, but as an affirmation of presence, a statement that survival did not require disappearance. She and Keanu met again not in front of cameras or crowds, but in a quiet place where conversation could exist without performance. And when they spoke, it was not about what had been lost, but about what had been reclaimed. There was no need for dramatic reconciliation or closure. The understanding between them was enough, built not on nostalgia, but on shared resolve and respect for the paths they had chosen. On an ordinary evening not long after, Keanu stood once more at his front door, listening to the familiar sounds of his neighborhood settling into night, and reflected on how a single moment of openness had altered the trajectory of so many lives. The door remained closed, the rain absent this time, but the lesson lingered with quiet certainty. Sometimes the most powerful act is not speaking first or loudest, but choosing not to turn away when truth arrives unannounced, asking only to be heard. And in that choice, Keanu understood, lay the kind of peace that no silence, however carefully constructed, could ever replace.